The morning of May 4th, 1945. Radar Picket Station Number One, 75 miles northwest of Okinawa. Commander Robert Morris stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Morrison, watching his radar operator track 50 aircraft closing from the northern sectors. The green blips multiplied across the scope like a deadly constellation. At 07:15 hours, the anticipated attack finally materialized as 25 Japanese suicide aircraft appeared on the horizon, their engines screaming toward the American fleet anchored off the bloodiest island in the Pacific. But Morris wasn't alone out there in those killing waters. 60 miles to his south, the United States Navy light cruiser USS Oakland steamed in formation with Task Force 58, her 16 5-inch guns trained skyward, her revolutionary radar systems sweeping the dawn sky for threats that conventional ships couldn't even see coming. The Oakland represented something entirely new in naval warfare, a vessel designed from her keel up to fill the sky with radar-guided steel and turn the tide of the air war that was consuming the Pacific Fleet one ship at a time. The Atlanta-class anti-aircraft cruisers had become the backbone of America's defense against the most dangerous enemy the United States Navy had ever faced. 10,000 aircraft that the Empire of Japan had reserved for one final, desperate gambit to sink the American invasion fleet and turn the tide of World War II. These weren't conventional bombers or fighters, these were kamikazes, human-guided missiles willing to die to destroy a single American warship. And standing between those suicide aircraft and the transport ships carrying 182,000 American soldiers were 8 of the most revolutionary warships ever built by American industry. The story of how the Atlanta-class cruisers came to dominate the radar picket stations around Okinawa begins not in the killing fields of the Pacific, but in the industrial heart of New Jersey, where the largest subsidiary of United States Steel Corporation was about to undertake the most ambitious warship construction program in American history. The Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company occupied 17 acres of prime waterfront real estate at Kearny Point, New Jersey, where the mouth of the Hackensack River meets Newark Bay in the port of New York and New Jersey. On a clear morning in 1940, you could see the Manhattan skyline from the shipyard's main gate. But the men streaming through those gates weren't looking at skyscrapers, they were looking at the future of American naval power taking shape on the ways. James Alessandro Toretti, a third-generation Italian-American welder from Newark, clocked in at 0600 hours on April 22, 1940, for what would become the most important day of his working life. Today, Federal Shipbuilding would lay the keel of a new type of warship that would change the course of naval warfare forever. The USS Atlanta, hull number CL-51, was about to begin her journey from blueprint to battle-tested defender of the American fleet. Never seen anything like her, Toretti told his welding partner, Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant whose family had fled the rising Nazi regime in 1938. Müller nodded as they examined the blueprints spread across the construction supervisor's table. The Atlanta was unlike any cruiser either man had worked on before. Where conventional cruisers mounted 6-inch or 8-inch guns designed to punch holes in enemy armor, this new ship would carry 16 5-inch guns arranged in 8 twin turrets, more anti-aircraft firepower than any cruiser in the world. The specifications were staggering. 541 feet of overall length, 53 feet and 2 inches of beam, and a standard displacement of 6,718 tons. The Atlanta would be powered by 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers generating 75,000 shaft horsepower through 2 Westinghouse-geared turbines, giving her a design speed of 32.5 knots. But speed wasn't her primary weapon, volume of fire was. Federal Shipbuilding's president, Lynn Korndorff, understood the magnitude of what his company was undertaking. The Atlanta class represented a fundamental shift in naval thinking, away from the battleship-centric doctrines of the past toward a new reality where aircraft posed the greatest threat to fleet operations. The United States Navy had committed to building 8 of these revolutionary anti-aircraft cruisers, and Federal had won the contract to build the first 4. The company had been preparing for this moment since 1917, when James Farrell Sr., the chief of United States Steel's export subsidiary, established Federal to provide reliable ocean transportation for American steel products. By 1921, Federal had built shipbuilding ways for 12 15,000-ton vessels and constructed a 9,000-ton floating dry dock. The Kearny Yard covered 17 acres with 2,400 feet of frontage on the Hackensack River, employing thousands of skilled craftsmen who would transform raw steel into the most sophisticated warships on Earth. But building the Atlanta class would require more than skilled labor, it would require innovation on an unprecedented scale. The morning shift at Federal Shipbuilding began at 0600 hours, when 10,000 workers streamed through the gates to begin another day of the most complex manufacturing operation in American history. By 1941, Federal employed more people than many American cities, and their collective expertise was about to create something that had never existed before. A cruiser designed from the waterline up to defend against aerial attack. Chief Naval Architect Thomas Brennan spread the latest design revisions across his drafting table in Building 77, the massive brick structure that housed Federal's engineering department. The Atlanta class had evolved considerably from the original 1936 concept, when the Second London Naval Treaty imposed an 8,000-ton limit on new cruiser construction. The treaty makers had envisioned smaller, cheaper cruisers, but they hadn't anticipated the revolution in naval aviation that would make aircraft the primary threat to surface vessels. The British are building their Dido class with 5.25-inch guns, Brennan explained to his team of junior engineers, pointing to intelligence reports spread across the adjacent table. Heavier punch, but slower rate of fire. We're going with the 5-inch 38 caliber, 16 of them in 8 twin mounts. 6 on the centerline in 3 levels, 2 more on the broadside. The decision to mount 16 5-inch guns instead of the traditional 6-inch or 8-inch main battery was revolutionary. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun had proven itself the finest dual-purpose weapon in the world, capable of engaging both surface targets and aircraft with devastating effectiveness. Each gun could fire 15 rounds per minute, meaning the Atlanta could theoretically put 17,600 pounds of steel into the air every 60 seconds. But theoretical firepower meant nothing without the fire control systems to direct it effectively. The Atlanta would carry 2 Mark 37 gun directors, revolutionary devices that combined optical rangefinding with the latest radar technology. The Mark 37 could track targets automatically, computing firing solutions faster than any human gun crew, and directing the ship's main battery with unprecedented accuracy. Combined with the new VT proximity fused shells, a secret so closely guarded that even the factory workers producing them didn't know how they worked, the Atlanta's fire control system represented the most advanced anti-aircraft defense ever mounted on a warship. Rosa Martinez had been working in Federal's electrical department since 1939, when her husband Miguel was laid off from the Brooklyn Navy Yard during the pre-war reduction in naval construction. Rosa specialized in the complex wiring harnesses that connected the Atlanta's radar systems to her gun director's delicate work that required steady hands and absolute precision. A single misconnection could render the entire fire control system useless, leaving the ship's guns to engage targets manually. Each radar cable has to be perfect, Rosa explained to the new girls hired during Federal's massive expansion in 1941. One bad solder joint and our boys might not come home. The weight of that responsibility settled on every worker in the yard. They weren't just building ships, they were building the tools that would determine whether American sailors lived or died in the battles to come. The Atlanta's secondary armament presented its own challenges. Initially, the ships would mount 12 1.1-inch guns in 3 quad mountings, the infamous Chicago pianos, that had proven notoriously unreliable in service. Federal's workers knew the 1.1-inch guns were problematic, but they were what the Navy had available in 1941. Later ships in the class would replace the Chicago pianos with Swedish-designed Bofors 40mm guns, but the early Atlantas would have to make do with what American industry could provide. The close-in defense would be handled by 20mm Oerlikon cannons, rapid-fire weapons that could engage aircraft making their final attack runs. 8 of these weapons would be mounted in single mounts disposed around the ship, 2 on the forward superstructure, for amidships between the funnels, and 2 on the quarterdeck aft. As the war progressed and the threat from Japanese kamikaze attacks intensified, more and more 20mm guns would be added until some Atlanta-class ships carried upward of 20 of the rapid-fire weapons. But raw firepower was only part of the Atlanta's revolutionary design. These ships would also carry 8 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quad launchers, making them the only class of United States Navy cruisers commissioned during World War II to be armed with torpedoes. The torpedo armament reflected the Atlanta's original intended role as destroyer flotilla leaders, vessels that would coordinate large formations of destroyers in attacks against enemy battle lines. The second shift at Federal Shipbuilding began at 1400 hours, when the day workers handed over their tools to the men and women who would work through the night to keep America's warship production on schedule. By 1942, Federal operated around the clock, 7 days a week, racing to complete ships faster than the enemy could sink them. Supervisor Frank Kowalinsky had been with Federal since the First World War, when the company built 30 design 1037 cargo ships for the United States Shipping Board. Now, at age 57, he was overseeing the construction of the most advanced warships ever built by American industry. The Atlanta class represented everything Kowalinsky had learned about shipbuilding over 3 decades in the trade, and he was determined to build them better than any ships had ever been built before. Speed and quality, Kowalinsky told his shift supervisors during the nightly planning meeting in Building 77. The Navy needs these ships, and they need them perfect. No shortcuts, no compromises. The message was clear throughout the yard. Every weld had to be perfect, every system had to be tested, and every ship had to be capable of bringing her crew home safely. The Atlanta's main propulsion represented another revolution in American naval design. Unlike larger cruisers that used 4 propeller shafts for maximum power, the Atlanta class employed a 2-shaft arrangement more typical of destroyers. This decision reflected the ship's origins as flotilla leaders, vessels that needed to be fast and maneuverable rather than heavily armored. The 2-shaft design also reduced mechanical complexity and saved weight that could be devoted to armament and fire control systems. Power came from 4 665-pound per square inch boilers connected to 2 Westinghouse-geared steam turbines. The entire propulsion plant was designed to produce 75,000 shaft horsepower, enough to drive the Atlanta at better than 33 knots faster than most destroyers and fast enough to keep pace with the aircraft carriers the Atlanta class was designed to protect. The boiler rooms were marvels of compact engineering, packed with the latest American steam technology. Each boiler was a precision instrument capable of generating superheated steam at temperatures and pressures that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The engineering spaces were arranged according to the unit principle, with each boiler room and engine room capable of independent operation. Even if half the propulsion plant were destroyed by enemy action, the Atlanta could still make way and fight. Chief Machinist William Chun had immigrated to America from Canton Province in 1928, bringing with him a mechanical aptitude that Federal supervisors quickly recognized. Chun specialized in the precise tolerances required for the Atlanta's turbine installations, work that demanded both technical expertise and artistic sensibility. The massive turbines had to be balanced within thousandths of an inch, or they would tear themselves apart at operating speed. Steam is power, but precision is everything, Chin explained to his apprentices as they assembled the Atlanta's port turbine. These machines will run for years without maintenance, thousands of miles from the nearest shipyard. They have to be perfect. Chen's perfectionism was typical of Federal's skilled craftsmen, men and women who understood that their work would be tested in battle against the finest naval engineering the world had ever produced. The Atlanta's armor protection was deliberately light by cruiser standards, reflecting her intended role as a fast escort rather than a line of battleship. The main belt armor was 3 3/4 inches thick, enough to protect against destroyer gunfire but not heavy cruiser shells. The turrets were protected by 1 1/4 inches of armor, the deck by 1 1/4 inches, and the conning tower by 2 1/2 inches. This armor arrangement would prove controversial later in the war, when 2 Atlanta-class ships were lost in surface combat, but it reflected the design priorities of 1940. Speed and firepower over protection. September 6, 1941. The USS Atlanta slides down the ways at Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company. Sponsored by Margaret Mitchell, author of Gone with the Wind, and daughter of the city, whose name the ship would carry into battle. 10,000 spectators cheered as the Atlanta entered the water for the first time, her sleek hull gleaming with fresh paint and the promise of victories to come. The launch ceremony was a celebration of American industrial might, but it was also a somber reminder that the nation was rapidly approaching a war that would test every ship, every system, and every sailor the United States Navy could produce. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were sinking American merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. In the Pacific, The Empire of Japan was consolidating its conquests and preparing for what Japanese strategists believed would be the decisive battle of the Pacific War. Federal's workers understood the stakes. Every ship they built might mean the difference between victory and defeat, between democracy and fascism, between freedom and totalitarian domination of the world's oceans. The Atlanta and her sisters represented America's best hope of maintaining control of the seas that connected the United States to its allies around the world. Fitting out the Atlanta would take 3 more months of intensive work. Every system had to be installed, tested, and calibrated to the precise specifications demanded by modern naval warfare. The ship's radar equipment was so secret that civilian workers weren't allowed to observe its installation. Only Navy personnel with the highest security clearances were permitted to work on the systems that would give the Atlanta her revolutionary capability to detect and engage enemy aircraft at ranges previously impossible. The Mark IV fire control radar was the key to the Atlanta's effectiveness. This revolutionary device could track aerial targets automatically, providing the gun directors with precise range and bearing information that would allow the 5-inch guns to engage enemy aircraft at maximum effective range. Combined with the new VT proximity fused shells, the Mark IV radar transformed the Atlanta from a conventional warship into something entirely new, a mobile anti-aircraft fortress capable of defending an entire task force against aerial attack. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Jenkins, the Atlanta's first commanding officer, arrived at Federal Shipbuilding in November 1941 to oversee the final stages of his ship's construction. Jenkins had been carefully selected for this command. He was one of the Navy's leading experts on anti-aircraft warfare, and he understood better than most officers the revolution in naval combat that aircraft had created. "She's not like anything we've ever built before," Jenkins confided to his executive officer, Commander Lloyd Mustin, as they toured their new command. "Everything about her is designed around one mission: keeping enemy aircraft away from our carriers and transports. If we do our job right, they'll never get close enough to drop their bombs." Jenkins was right about the Atlanta's revolutionary nature, but he couldn't have anticipated the full scope of the missions his ship would be called upon to perform. The Atlanta class would prove adaptable to roles their designers had never imagined, from radar picket duty in the most dangerous waters of the Pacific to surface combat in the dark, confused melees that characterized the Guadalcanal campaign. The Atlanta was commissioned on December 24, 1941, at the New York Navy Yard, just 17 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into World War II. The timing was prophetic. The Atlanta and her sisters would spend their entire service careers fighting the war that began with that surprise attack, and they would play crucial roles in every major campaign from Midway to the final surrender of Japan. June 4, 1942. Task Force 16 steams northwest of Midway Atoll, preparing for what Admiral Chester Nimitz had called the most important naval battle in American history. The Japanese combined fleet was approaching Midway with 4 aircraft carriers and the finest naval aviators in the world, planning to destroy the remnants of the Pacific Fleet and force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. Standing between the Japanese Armada and total victory was the most powerful anti-aircraft warship ever built, the USS Atlanta, making her combat debut as part of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance's task force centered on the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. The Atlanta's 16 5-inch guns were trained skyward, her radar systems sweeping the empty ocean for the first signs of the aerial armada that Japanese intelligence promised was coming. Fire Controlman Second Class Anthony Battaglia manned the Atlanta's Mark IV radar in the ship's Combat Information Center, a darkened compartment deep within the ship where the revolution in naval warfare was being fought with oscilloscope screens and radio waves instead of guns and torpedoes. Battaglia had trained for months on the radar system, but this would be his first opportunity to use the revolutionary technology against a live enemy. Contact bearing 015, range 32 miles. Battaglia reported to the bridge as Japanese scout planes appeared on his radar screen. The enemy aircraft were still beyond visual range, but the Atlanta's radar could track them with precision that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. The age of radar warfare had begun, and the Atlanta was its most sophisticated practitioner. The Battle of Midway would prove to be a decisive American victory, but not in the way Admiral Spruance had expected. The Japanese attack on Midway came in waves, with dozens of bombers and fighters approaching at high altitude before diving toward their targets. The Atlanta's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, filling the sky with precisely aimed bursts that began downing Japanese aircraft long before they could reach their bomb release points. Lieutenant Commander Jenkins watched from the Atlanta's bridge as his ship's guns engaged target after target, the Mark IV radar providing firing solutions faster and more accurately than any human gun director could manage. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun was proving itself the finest anti-aircraft weapon in the world, and the Atlanta was demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of concentrated firepower directed by radar. Target bearing 090, range 12,000 yards, closing fast, came the report from the Combat Information Center. 3 Japanese dive bombers had broken through the outer fighter screen and were approaching the task force at high speed, their bomb bays loaded with armor-piercing weapons designed to sink American aircraft carriers. The Atlanta's after-gun director swung toward the approaching bombers, its radar antenna tracking the targets automatically as the ship's computers calculated the precise firing solution needed to intercept aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour. At 8,000 yards, the 5-inch guns opened fire, sending a stream of radar-fused shells directly into the path of the oncoming aircraft. The first bomber disintegrated in a ball of fire and metal fragments as a VT shell exploded just 50 feet from the aircraft's cockpit. The second bomber, damaged by fragments from the first explosion, pulled up sharply and jettisoned its bomb harmlessly into the ocean. The third bomber pressed its attack, diving toward the Enterprise with grim determination, but a second salvo from the Atlanta's guns caught the aircraft at 4,000 feet, sending it spinning into the sea in a shower of burning debris. "Splash 3 bogeys," reported the air defense officer. Using the naval term for confirmed aerial victories, the Atlanta had proven her worth in her first combat action, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of radar-directed anti-aircraft fire against even the finest naval aviators in the world. But Midway was only the beginning. The Atlanta and her sisters would soon be called upon to perform missions their designers had never imagined, in waters where the enemy's desperation would transform conventional aircraft into human-guided missiles, willing to die to destroy a single American warship. August 7, 1942. The USS Atlanta steams in formation with the amphibious task force approaching Guadalcanal, the obscure jungle island that would become the crucible of American naval aviation and the proving ground for the Atlanta-class cruisers. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal that could threaten Allied supply lines throughout the South Pacific. The American response was Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War. The Atlanta's mission was to provide anti-aircraft protection for the transport ships carrying the 1st Marine Division to their assault beaches. But the ship would soon be called upon to perform missions far beyond her original design parameters. The Japanese response to the American landings would be swift and violent, testing every system and every sailor aboard the revolutionary anti-aircraft cruiser. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Chun, the ship's assistant gunnery officer and son of Federal shipbuilding machinist William Chun, stood at his battle station in the Atlanta's forward gun director as the ship's radar detected the first Japanese air attack approaching from the northwest. 36 bombers and fighters were inbound from Rabaul, the massive Japanese base that controlled air operations throughout the South Pacific. All stations, air raid, came the announcement over the ship's general announcing system. The Atlanta's crew rushed to battle stations as the ship's 5-inch guns trained skyward, and the Mark IV radar began tracking the approaching enemy formation. This would be the Atlanta's first major test under combat conditions, and every man aboard understood that the lives of 18,000 Marines depended on their ability to keep Japanese bombers away from the transport ships. The air battle began at 26,000 yards, when the Atlanta's fire control radar locked onto the leading Japanese bombers. The 5-inch guns opened fire in carefully timed salvos, filling the sky ahead of the enemy formation with precisely placed bursts of high explosive and steel fragments. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to attacking targets defended only by machine guns and small-caliber anti-aircraft weapons, found themselves flying into a steel curtain that no aircraft could penetrate. Seaman First Class Miguel Santos operated one of the Atlanta's 20mm guns, the close-in defense weapons that would engage any enemy aircraft that survived the 5-inch barrage. Santos was the son of a Mexican immigrant family that had settled in East Los Angeles during the Depression, and he had joined the Navy seeking both adventure and a steady paycheck. Now he found himself at the sharp end of the most important battle of the Pacific War. "Here they come," Santos called to his loader as 3 Japanese dive bombers broke through the 5-inch fire and dove toward the transport area. The 20mm gun chattered as Santos tracked the leading bomber, his tracers stitching across the sky toward the diving aircraft. The bomber shuddered as 20mm shells punched through its wings and fuselage, but the pilot pressed his attack with the fatalistic courage that characterized Japanese naval aviation. The bomber's bomb exploded in the water just 50 yards from the transport ship USS Macaulay, sending a towering column of water and debris skyward, but causing no significant damage. The bomber itself crashed into the sea moments later, its pilot dead at the controls of his shattered aircraft. 2 more bombers pressed their attacks, but concentrated fire from the Atlanta's secondary battery drove them off before they could reach their bomb release points. The Guadalcanal campaign would continue for 6 months, with the Atlanta serving as the primary air defense coordinator for American forces in the South Pacific. The ship would shoot down dozens of Japanese aircraft and save countless American lives. But the campaign would also demonstrate the limitations of the Atlanta-class design when pressed into missions for which it had never been intended. The waters between Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Florida Island had earned a grim nickname among American sailors. Iron Bottom Sound, named for the dozens of warships that had been sunk in the savage night battles that characterized the Guadalcanal campaign. On the night of November 13, 1942, Iron Bottom Sound would claim its most prestigious victims, 2 of the finest ships ever built by American industry. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's Task Force 67 was steaming through Sealark Channel at 24 knots, racing to intercept a Japanese surface force that intelligence reported was approaching Guadalcanal with the intent of bombarding Henderson Field and destroying the American airstrip that had become the key to control of the South Pacific. The task force consisted of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, including the USS Atlanta and her sister ship USS Juno. The Japanese force was formidable: 2 fast battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers under the command of Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, one of the Imperial Navy's most aggressive surface warfare specialists. The Japanese ships were racing south through the slot, the body of water between the Solomon Islands that had become the highway for Japanese reinforcement runs to Guadalcanal. Admiral Callahan faced a tactical nightmare. His force was outnumbered and outgunned, with no battleships to match the Japanese Kirishima and Hai. But Callahan had advantages that Japanese intelligence had failed to appreciate: radar-directed gunfire and the most concentrated anti-aircraft firepower in the world mounted aboard his 2 Atlanta-class cruisers. The battle began at 01:48 hours when the opposing forces met at point-blank range in the darkness between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. Radar had given the Americans advance warning of the Japanese approach, but the confused night action that followed would test the Atlanta's systems and crew beyond anything they had previously experienced. Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless, the Atlanta's communications officer, was monitoring the tactical radio circuits when the first Japanese destroyer launched torpedoes at the American column. "Torpedoes in the water," McCandless reported to Captain Jenkins on the bridge, but in the darkness and confusion of the night battle, accurate target identification became almost impossible. The Atlanta's 5-inch guns opened fire at the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki at a range of just 3,000 yards, their muzzle flashes illuminating the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound with deadly fireworks. The Akatsuki staggered under the concentrated fire from the American cruiser, her superstructure shattered and her engines damaged, but not before the Japanese destroyer had launched her own spread of deadly long-lance torpedoes. At 01:51 hours, a Japanese torpedo struck the Atlanta's port side forward of the No. 1 engine room, exploding with a tremendous blast that shook the entire ship and knocked out her electrical power. The torpedo hit was followed seconds later by gunfire from the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, which had mistaken the Atlanta for a Japanese ship in the confusion of the night battle. 19 8-inch shells from the San Francisco struck the Atlanta in rapid succession, devastating her superstructure and killing Admiral Norman Scott and most of his staff. Captain Jenkins was mortally wounded on the bridge, and the ship's executive officer, Commander Lloyd Muston, found himself in command of a cruiser that was rapidly becoming a floating wreck. "Damage control, report," Muston called into the ship's battle telephone circuit, But the responses he received painted a grim picture. The Atlanta was listing to port, her forward engine room was flooded, and fires were burning throughout her superstructure. Most critically, the torpedo hit had damaged her steering gear, leaving the ship unable to maneuver effectively. The Atlanta continued to fight even as she took on water and lost way. Her after 5-inch guns continued to engage Japanese targets, and her 20mm battery fired at anything that moved in the darkness around Iron Bottom Sound. The ship's crew displayed the kind of courage and determination that had made the United States Navy legendary throughout the world, but courage could not overcome the physical damage that the Atlanta had sustained. At 0600 hours on November 14th, with the Atlanta down by the bow and unable to steam, Commander Mustin made the most difficult decision any naval officer can make. He ordered his ship abandoned. The USS Atlanta, the first of her Revolutionary class and the most advanced anti-aircraft warship ever built, was scuttled by her own crew to prevent her capture by the enemy. The loss of the Atlanta was a devastating blow to American morale, but it was not the end of the story for the Atlanta-class cruisers. 7 more ships of the class were still under construction, and they would incorporate the lessons learned from the Atlanta's brief but heroic career. More importantly, American intelligence was beginning to understand the true nature of the threat facing the Pacific Fleet. Japanese aircraft were becoming progressively more desperate and more willing to die to destroy American ships. By late 1944, the character of the Pacific War had undergone a fundamental transformation. The Japanese combined fleet had been effectively destroyed in the great carrier battles of the previous 2 years, leaving Japan with few options for halting the American advance across the Central Pacific. In desperation, Japanese military leaders had embraced a tactic that would change naval warfare forever: the organized use of suicide aircraft to attack American ships. The first large-scale kamikaze attacks had been launched during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American warships with devastating effect. The escort carrier USS St. Lo was sunk by a single kamikaze, and several other ships were severely damaged by pilots who had abandoned all hope of survival in favor of taking as many Americans with them as possible. American naval intelligence, led by Commander Edwin Layton at Pacific Fleet Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, was quick to recognize the implications of this new Japanese tactic. If the enemy was willing to use suicide attacks on a large scale, then the planned invasion of Japan would face aerial opposition unlike anything previously encountered in naval warfare. Traditional anti-aircraft defense, based on shooting down enough enemy aircraft to break up their attacks, would be useless against pilots who expected to die and were willing to fly damaged aircraft into American ships. The solution would require new tactics, new technology, and new types of ships specifically designed to detect and destroy suicide aircraft before they could reach their targets. The Atlanta-class cruisers, with their powerful radar systems and concentrated anti-aircraft firepower, would prove to be the ideal platform for the most dangerous mission in the Pacific Fleet: radar picket duty. Captain Arleigh Burke, one of the Navy's most innovative tactical thinkers, was tasked with developing the doctrine that would govern radar picket operations during the invasion of Okinawa. Burke understood that conventional fleet formations, designed to maximize mutual support between ships, would be inadequate against kamikaze attacks that could come from any direction at any time. "We need early warning," Burke explained to his staff officers during a planning conference at Ulithi Atoll in February 1945. "The Japanese are going to throw everything they have at our invasion force, and we need to see them coming before they can get close enough to cause damage." Burke's solution was revolutionary. Establish a ring of radar picket stations around Okinawa, each manned by destroyers and destroyer escorts equipped with the latest air search radars. These picket ships would provide early warning of Japanese air attacks and coordinate the combat air patrols that would intercept enemy aircraft before they could reach the main body of the invasion fleet. But radar picket duty would prove to be the most dangerous assignment in the Pacific Fleet. The picket ships would be stationed 50 to 75 miles from the main fleet, isolated and vulnerable to concentrated attack by Japanese suicide aircraft. The ships assigned to picket duty would need the most powerful anti-aircraft armament available, along with the radar systems and fire control equipment necessary to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The mission called for the Atlanta-class cruisers. While the first Atlanta-class ships were fighting and dying in the waters around Guadalcanal, Federal Shipbuilding was already at work on an improved version of the design that would incorporate the lessons learned in combat. The second group of Atlanta-class ships, sometimes called the Oakland-class after the lead ship, would be optimized specifically for anti-aircraft warfare based on 2 years of combat experience in the Pacific. The most significant change was the reduction in main battery armament from 16 5-inch guns to 12, accomplished by deleting the 2 wing turrets that had proven problematic in service. The weight saved was used to mount additional 40mm Bofors guns, the Swedish-designed anti-aircraft weapons that had proven far superior to the American 1.1-inch guns originally mounted on the early ships. Chief designer Thomas Brennan studied combat reports from the Pacific Fleet as he refined the design of the Oakland and her sisters. The reports made clear that the original Atlanta-class ships had been vulnerable to stability problems as additional equipment was added during their service careers. The deletion of the wing turrets would improve stability while actually increasing anti-aircraft effectiveness by allowing more intermediate-caliber weapons to be mounted. The 5-inch guns are magnificent for long-range work, Brennan explained to Federal's senior management during a design review conference in Building 77. But when the Japanese get close, the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons are what keep our ships alive. We need more of them, properly directed by radar. The Oakland-class ships would mount 4 twin 40mm Bofors guns from the start of their careers, along with up to 16 20mm Oerlikon cannons disposed around the ships to provide close-in defense against kamikaze attacks. Each Bofors mount would be controlled by its own Mark 51 gun director, a miniature radar system that could track individual aircraft and provide precise firing solutions for the rapid-fire guns. Federal Shipbuilding had expanded dramatically to meet wartime production demands, growing from 10,000 workers in 1940 to more than 25,000 by 1943. The company had also opened a second facility at Port Newark, New Jersey, specifically for the construction of destroyer escorts and later destroyers. The expansion had made Federal one of the largest employers in the New York metropolitan area and one of the most important contributors to American naval power. Rosa Martinez had been promoted to supervisor of electrical installation for the Oakland-class ships, overseeing a team of more than 200 women who specialized in the complex wiring required for modern fire control systems. The new ships would carry even more sophisticated radar equipment than their predecessors, including improved air search radars and enhanced gun director systems that could track multiple targets simultaneously. Every wire has to be perfect, Martinez reminded her team during the daily quality control briefing. Our boys are depending on these systems to keep them alive when the Japanese throw everything they have at our ships. The women working under Martinez's supervision understood the critical importance of their work, and they took pride in knowing that their craftsmanship would make the difference between life and death for American sailors in the Pacific. The Oakland was launched on October 23, 1942, just 6 weeks after the loss of the Atlanta at the Battle of Guadalcanal. The launch ceremony was more subdued than the Atlantas had been, reflecting the grim reality of the war that was consuming ships faster than American industry could replace them. But the Oakland and her sisters represented a new generation of anti-aircraft cruisers, ships that would prove even more effective than their predecessors at the mission of protecting American task forces from aerial attack. October 20th, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur wades ashore on the beach at Leyte, fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines and beginning the campaign that would bring American forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. But MacArthur's return was made possible by the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific, more than 700 ships of the 3rd and 7th Fleets, including 6 Atlanta-class cruisers that would soon face the most dangerous threat of their careers. The USS Oakland, flagship of Cruiser Division 13, steamed with Task Group 38.3 as the fast carriers launched strike after strike against Japanese airfields throughout the Philippines. The Oakland's mission was to protect the aircraft carriers from Japanese air attack. But the nature of that threat was about to change in a way that would revolutionize naval warfare forever. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, had reached a desperate conclusion. Conventional air attacks against the massive American fleet were doomed to failure. Japanese naval aviation had been decimated in the Great Carrier Battles of 1944, and the few experienced pilots remaining were no match for American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. But Onishi had conceived a new tactic that might succeed where conventional attacks had failed. Organized suicide attacks by pilots willing to crash their aircraft directly into American warships. The first kamikaze attack of the Philippines campaign was launched on October 21, 1944, when 13 Japanese aircraft approached Task Group 38.3 from multiple directions simultaneously. The Oakland's air search radar detected the approaching aircraft at 35 miles. But there was something different about this attack. Instead of turning away when engaged by American fighters, the Japanese aircraft pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, the Oakland's air defense officer, watched from the ship's combat information center as the radar plots developed into the most dangerous tactical situation he had ever encountered. "They're not trying to escape," Patterson reported to Captain William Thomas on the bridge. "Every one of them is boring straight in, no matter what we throw at them." The Oakland's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, filling the sky with precisely aimed bursts that began downing Japanese aircraft at distances that would have broken up any conventional attack. But the kamikaze pilots flew through the barrage with grim determination, their aircraft absorbing damage that would have forced normal pilots to turn back. Even aircraft with engines on fire and control surfaces shot away continued their attacks, guided by pilots who had already resigned themselves to death. Fire Control Man First Class David Kim manned one of the Oakland's Mark 51 directors, controlling a twin 40mm Bofors mount as it engaged a Japanese fighter that had penetrated the 5-inch barrage. Kim's grandfather had immigrated to Hawaii from Korea in 1905, and his family had faced suspicion and discrimination after Pearl Harbor despite their complete loyalty to the United States. Now Kim found himself defending American ships against an enemy that shared his Asian heritage but none of his values. The Mitsubishi Zero fighter that Kim was tracking had been hit repeatedly by 5-inch fire. Its port wing was nearly severed, and flames were streaming from its engine cowling. But the pilot pressed his attack with mechanical precision, ignoring the 40mm shells that were punching holes through his aircraft. At 500 yards, Kim's final burst finally found the fighter's engine, sending the aircraft cartwheeling into the sea just short of its target. "Splash one bandit," Kim reported. But there was no satisfaction in the victory. The Japanese pilot had come closer to succeeding than any conventional attack could have managed. And Kim understood that this new type of warfare would test American air defenses in ways that no one had previously imagined. The kamikaze attacks during the Philippines campaign were just a preview of what was to come. Japanese military leaders were planning to use suicide tactics on an unprecedented scale during the defense of Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself. 10,000 aircraft had been reserved for the kamikaze operations that would be launched against American invasion forces, and the Atlanta-class cruisers would find themselves at the center of the most intense aerial combat in naval history. March 26, 1945. The greatest armada in naval history approaches the Ryukyu Islands, beginning Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. 828 ships of the United States Pacific Fleet steam in formation toward beaches that American intelligence knows will be defended by more than 100,000 Japanese troops commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, one of the Imperial Army's most capable defensive specialists. Among the approaching ships are 6 Atlanta-class cruisers: the USS Oakland, USS San Diego, USS San Juan, USS Reno, USS Flint, and USS Tucson. These ships have been assigned to the most dangerous mission in the Pacific Fleet, manning the radar picket stations that will provide early warning of the massive kamikaze attacks that Japanese commanders are planning to launch against the American invasion force. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, understood the critical importance of early warning in defending against suicide aircraft. Conventional fleet air defense depended on fighters intercepting enemy aircraft at long range, but kamikazes would press their attacks regardless of casualties. The only way to defeat them would be to detect them early and concentrate overwhelming firepower at the point of attack. Spruance's solution was revolutionary. Establish 15 radar picket stations in a ring around Okinawa, each station manned by destroyers and destroyer escorts equipped with the latest air search radars. The picket ships would detect Japanese aircraft while they were still 50 to 75 miles away from the main fleet, providing sufficient time for combat air patrols to intercept them or for the ships to concentrate their anti-aircraft fire. But the radar picket stations would also become the primary targets for Japanese kamikaze attacks. The pilots knew that destroying the picket ships would blind the American fleet to follow-up attacks, making the radar pickets the highest priority targets in the Japanese target hierarchy. The ships assigned to picket duty would face concentrated attacks by dozens of suicide aircraft simultaneously, testing their air defense systems beyond anything previously experienced in naval warfare. The USS Oakland had been assigned to coordinate air defense for the entire Fifth Fleet, a mission that reflected both the ship's sophisticated radar systems and her crew's expertise in anti-aircraft warfare. Captain William Thomas had trained his crew to the highest standards of readiness, knowing that the survival of the entire invasion force might depend on their ability to detect and engage enemy aircraft before they could reach their targets. April 6, 1945. At 0300 hours, more than 700 Japanese aircraft begin launching from airfields throughout Kyushu, Formosa, and Korea for the first mass kamikaze attack against the American forces invading Okinawa. Operation Kikyusui Number One, named for the floating chrysanthemums that symbolize the fallen warriors of Japanese tradition, would be the largest single air attack launched by any nation during World War II. The Japanese plan was elegantly simple and utterly ruthless. 355 kamikaze aircraft would attack American ships in waves, each wave timed to arrive just as the previous attack was ending. The suicide pilots had been briefed to target aircraft carriers, transports, and any ship that appeared to be coordinating air defense operations. Behind the kamikazes would come 341 conventional bombers and fighters, tasked with finishing off ships damaged by the suicide attacks. Aboard the USS Oakland, steaming 20 miles northwest of the main transport area, Lieutenant Commander Robert Chun monitored the ship's air search radar as the first Japanese formations appeared on the edge of his screen. Chun was the son of federal shipbuilding machinist William Chun and had been promoted to air defense officer based on his performance during the Philippines campaign. Now he was about to face the greatest test of his career. Multiple bogies, bearing 320, range 75 miles and closing. Chun reported to Captain Thomas on the bridge. The radar signature was unlike anything Chun had seen before. Instead of the small formations typical of conventional air attacks, his screen was showing a solid mass of contacts stretching across 30 degrees of bearing. "Sir, I count at least 100 aircraft, maybe more. They're coming straight at us." The Oakland's Combat Information Center became a hive of activity as radar operators tracked the approaching enemy formation and fighter direction officers vectored American combat air patrols toward the intercept. But there were too many Japanese aircraft and too few American fighters to stop them all. Some of the kamikazes would get through, and when they did, the Oakland and her sisters would be the only thing standing between the suicide pilots and the transport ships carrying 182,000 American soldiers. At 0630 hours, the first kamikaze aircraft penetrated the combat air patrol and dove toward the radar picket stations surrounding Okinawa. The USS Bush, manning radar picket station number 1 with her consort USS Colquhoun, found herself under attack by 40 aircraft simultaneously. The two destroyers fought with desperate courage, their guns firing continuously as kamikaze after kamikaze dove toward them from all directions. Seaman First Class Thomas Brennan Jr., son of Federal Shipbuilding's chief designer, manned one of the Bush's 20mm guns as Japanese aircraft swarmed around his ship like angry wasps. Brennan had been assigned to the Bush fresh out of gunnery school, and this was his first experience with the reality of kamikaze warfare. The Japanese pilots seemed oblivious to the intense anti-aircraft fire that was shredding their aircraft, pressing their attacks with mechanical determination that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. "Here comes another one," Brennan called to his loader as a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber dove toward the Bush with its engine on fire and its port wing nearly shot away. Brennan's 20mm gun chattered as he tracked the diving aircraft, his tracers walking across the bomber's fuselage and engine cowling. The aircraft shuddered under the impacts, but the pilot held his course with grim determination. The bomber struck the Bush just aft of the forward stack, its bomb exploding in the destroyer's after engine room and breaking the ship's back. The Bush settled rapidly by the stern as her crew abandoned ship, but her sacrifice had not been in vain. The two destroyers had shot down 11 Japanese aircraft and disrupted an attack that might otherwise have reached the main body of the invasion fleet. Similar scenes were playing out at radar picket stations throughout the area around Okinawa. The USS Colhoun took 5 kamikaze hits and sank within minutes, her crew fighting to the end against impossible odds. The destroyer USS Maynard L. Able was struck by both a conventional kamikaze and a rocket-powered Oka suicide bomb, disintegrating in a tremendous explosion that sent shockwaves across the anchorage. As the first Kikusui attack reached its climax, the USS Oakland found herself at the center of the most intense air battle in naval history. 23 Japanese aircraft had penetrated the outer defenses and were approaching the cruiser from multiple directions, their pilots determined to sink the ship that was coordinating the American air defense effort. Captain Thomas watched from the Oakland's bridge as his ship's radar-directed 5-inch guns engaged target after target, filling the sky with precisely aimed bursts that were downing Japanese aircraft at an unprecedented rate. The ship's 12 5-inch guns were firing in continuous salvos, each salvo directed by the Mark 37 fire control system that could track multiple targets simultaneously. Target bearing 045, range 8,000, closing fast, reported the primary gun director. Solution set, batteries released. The Oakland's forward guns swung toward the new target, a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter that was diving toward the ship's starboard quarter with a 500-pound bomb slung beneath its fuselage. The fighter's pilot had already been hit twice by American fighters, but he was pressing his attack with the fanatical determination that characterized the kamikaze corps. The 5-inch guns fired in perfect synchronization, sending 4 VT-fused shells directly into the path of the diving fighter. The shells exploded in a precise pattern 50 feet ahead of the aircraft, creating a wall of steel fragments that no aircraft could penetrate. The Zero disintegrated instantly, its bomb exploding harmlessly in the water 200 yards from the Oakland's hull. But even as one threat was eliminated, 2 more kamikazes were approaching from the port side, flying just above the wave tops to avoid the ship's radar. Gunner's mate second-class Patricia Williams operated one of the Oakland's twin 40mm Bofors mounts. Her gun trained toward the sea-skimming aircraft that were approaching at 300 miles per hour. Williams was one of the first women to serve aboard a United States Navy warship in a combat role, part of an experimental program that had been quietly implemented as the Navy faced critical personnel shortages during the final stages of the war. Her presence aboard the Oakland had initially caused controversy among some crew members, but her competence and courage under fire had quickly earned their respect. The lead kamikaze was a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber that had been modified to carry a 1,000-pound bomb in place of its normal torpedo load. The aircraft was already damaged, with smoke trailing from its engine and holes punched through its wings by previous encounters with American fighters. But the pilot held his course with steady determination, ignoring the 40mm shells that were walking across his aircraft's fuselage. Williams kept her gun trained on the bomber as it closed the final 500 yards to her ship, her tracers stitching a deadly pattern across the aircraft's engine cowling. At 200 yards, her fire finally found its mark, and the bomber's engine exploded in a burst of flame and metal fragments. The aircraft nosed down sharply, striking the water just short of the Oakland's hull and exploding in a towering column of spray and debris. The second kamikaze, a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, pressed its attack from a different angle, diving toward the Oakland superstructure where the ship's radar antennas and fire control equipment were concentrated. But the ship's portside 20mm guns opened fire at point-blank range, filling the air with a stream of tracers that no aircraft could survive. The dive bomber was hit dozens of times in its final approach, its cockpit shattered and its control surfaces shot away. The aircraft crashed into the sea just 50 yards from the Oakland's port side, close enough for the crew to feel the heat from its burning fuel but not close enough to cause significant damage to the ship. When the first Kikusui attack finally ended at 1100 hours, the Oakland had engaged 47 separate aircraft and scored confirmed kills on 18 of them. The ship had not suffered a single casualty, despite being the primary target for the most concentrated kamikaze attack of the war. More importantly, the Oakland's air defense coordination had helped save dozens of other ships from destruction, demonstrating the effectiveness of radar-directed anti-aircraft defense against even the most determined suicide attacks. While the Atlanta-class cruisers provided overall air defense coordination for the invasion fleet, the most dangerous mission at Okinawa was being performed by the destroyers and destroyer escorts manning the radar picket stations. These ships were stationed 50 to 75 miles from the main fleet, isolated and vulnerable to concentrated kamikaze attacks that could come from any direction at any time. The USS Laffey, a Fletcher-class destroyer commanded by Commander F. Julian Beckton, was manning radar Picket Station Number One on April 16, 1945, when 50 Japanese aircraft approached her position in waves. What followed would be remembered as one of the most heroic actions in United States Navy history, as a single destroyer fought off repeated suicide attacks for 80 minutes of continuous combat. The Laffey's crew had been at general quarters since dawn, knowing that the Japanese had designated April 16th as a special attack day when maximum effort would be expended against American picket ships. Radar Picket Station Number One was the most dangerous assignment in the Pacific Fleet, having already claimed the destroyers USS Bush and USS Colquhoun during previous kamikaze attacks. Fire Controlman 3rd Class Anthony Gagliardi manned the Laffey's Mark 37 gun director, the same type of radar-controlled fire control system that had proven so effective aboard the Atlanta-class cruisers. Gagliardi's parents had immigrated to Boston from Italy in the 1920s, and his father worked in the Charlestown Navy Yard building the same type of destroyers that Anthony now served aboard. Multiple bogies bearing 090, range 25 miles and closing, Gagliardi reported as his radar screen filled with contacts approaching from the direction of Japan. The signature was ominously familiar, a mass of aircraft flying in loose formation at low altitude, the classic profile of a kamikaze attack formation. The first wave of kamikazes reached the Laffey at 08:27 hours, diving toward the destroyer from multiple directions simultaneously. The ship's 5.5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, their VT-fused shells creating a defensive barrage that began downing Japanese aircraft at 8,000 yards. But there were too many attackers for any single ship to handle, and several aircraft penetrated the 5-inch fire. A Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter dove toward the Laffey's bridge, its pilot aiming for the ship's superstructure where her radar antennas and fire control equipment were concentrated. The fighter was hit repeatedly by 40mm fire but pressed its attack with grim determination, striking the destroyer's radar mast and exploding in a burst of flame that destroyed several antenna arrays. The damage to the Laffey's radar system severely degraded her ability to engage targets at long range, forcing her gun crews to rely on visual tracking for the waves of kamikazes that continued to attack the isolated destroyer. But the ship's crew fought with desperate courage, manning their weapons even as Japanese aircraft crashed into their ship repeatedly. By the time the attack finally ended at 09:47 hours, the Laffey had been struck by 6 kamikaze aircraft and had suffered extensive damage to her superstructure and weapon systems. 32 of her crew had been killed and 71 wounded, but the ship remained afloat and able to fight. More importantly, the Laffey's sacrifice had prevented the Japanese aircraft from reaching the main body of the invasion fleet, saving countless American lives at the cost of tremendous courage by her crew. The Laffey would be remembered as the ship that would not die, but her action was representative of dozens of similar battles fought by American destroyers at the radar picket stations around Okinawa. These ships absorbed the fury of Japanese kamikaze attacks, trading their own survival for the safety of the transport ships and aircraft carriers that were the true targets of Japanese desperation. On the other side of the tactical equation, Japanese naval planners were watching the battle for Okinawa with growing desperation. The systematic destruction of Japanese air power over the Philippines had left the Imperial Navy with few options for stopping the American advance toward the home islands. But Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had conceived one final operation that might succeed in inflicting such heavy losses on the American fleet that negotiation would become possible. Operation Tengo called for the coordinated use of every available aircraft in the defense of Okinawa, with special emphasis on kamikaze attacks against American aircraft carriers and command ships. 10,000 aircraft had been allocated to the operation, including 5,000 kamikazes that would be launched in 10 massive attacks designed to overwhelm American air defenses through sheer volume. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, who had helped develop kamikaze tactics during the Philippines campaign, understood better than most Japanese officers the limitations of suicide attacks against American ships, equipped with radar and advanced anti-aircraft systems. The Atlanta-class cruisers in particular posed a significant threat to kamikaze operations, their sophisticated fire control systems capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously with devastating effectiveness. The American radar cruisers must be the primary targets, Inaguchi explained to the pilots of the 201st Air Group during their final briefing before the 6th Kikusui attack on May 10 and 11, 1945. These ships coordinate their fleet's air defense. If we can eliminate them, the follow-up attacks will have a much higher probability of success. Inaguchi's analysis was tactically sound, but he underestimated both the resilience of American fire control systems and the determination of American sailors to defend their ships against any threat. The Atlanta-class cruisers had been designed specifically to survive damage and continue fighting, with redundant radar systems and backup fire control equipment that could maintain defensive effectiveness even after absorbing significant battle damage. Lieutenant Yukio Seiki, one of the most experienced kamikaze pilots in the Imperial Navy, had volunteered for a special mission against the American radar coordination ship that intelligence had identified as the primary threat to Japanese air operations. Seiki understood that his chances of survival were essentially zero, but he was willing to sacrifice his life if his attack could contribute to the defense of Japan. Seiki's aircraft was a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter that had been modified specifically for kamikaze operations, with additional armor around the engine compartment and an enlarged bomb load that reduced its maneuverability but increased its destructive potential. The fighter carried a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb that could penetrate the deck armor of an American cruiser if delivered with sufficient accuracy. The 6th Kikusui attack began at dawn on May 10th, with 125 kamikaze aircraft approaching the American fleet in multiple waves. Seiki's fighter was part of the third wave, tasked with attacking any American ships that had survived the initial attacks by the first two waves. His target was the USS Oakland, the radar coordination ship that had been directing American air defenses throughout the Okinawa campaign. The USS Oakland was steaming in formation with Task Group 58.4 when her air search radar detected the approach of the 6th Kikusui attack. Lieutenant Commander Robert Chen, now the ship's executive officer after being promoted following his performance during the first kamikaze attacks, watched his radar screen fill with contacts approaching from the northwest. "Sir, I'm showing multiple formations, at least 100 aircraft inbound," Chan reported to Captain Thomas from the ship's Combat Information Center. "They're coming in waves just like the previous attacks. Estimate 15 minutes to contact." The Oakland had been modified extensively since arriving at Okinawa, with additional 40mm and 20mm guns mounted wherever space could be found. The ship now carried 24 Bofors guns and 32 Oerlikon cannons, giving her the heaviest close-in anti-aircraft armament of any ship in the Pacific Fleet. But weight growth from the additional weapons had created stability problems that made the ship roll more heavily in rough seas. Captain Thomas ordered general quarters as the Oakland's crew rushed to battle stations for what would be their most severe test of the entire Okinawa campaign. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had specifically targeted radar coordination ships for destruction, making the Oakland a high-priority target for kamikaze attacks. The first wave of Japanese aircraft reached the task group at 07:45 hours, with 25 kamikazes diving toward the formation from multiple directions simultaneously. The Oakland's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, their radar-directed salvos creating a defensive barrage that began downing Japanese aircraft at 12,000 yards. Gunners Mate 2nd Class Patricia Williams, now promoted to gun captain for Mount 52, directed her twin 40mm Bofors as it engaged a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber that had penetrated the 5-inch fire. The bomber was already heavily damaged, with smoke streaming from its engine and holes punched through its wings, but the pilot pressed his attack with mechanical determination. Williams kept her gun trained on the bomber as it closed the final 1,000 yards to her ship, her tracers stitching a deadly pattern across the aircraft's fuselage. At 500 yards, her fire found the bomber's engine, sending the aircraft spinning into the sea just short of the task group formation. But even as one threat was eliminated, more kamikazes were approaching from different directions, testing the Oakland's ability to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The ship's radar systems were tracking 17 separate aircraft, each one a potential ship killer if it reached its target. Lieutenant Yukio Seiki's Zero fighter approached the Oakland from the port quarter, flying at 200 feet above the water to avoid the ship's air search radar. Seiki had studied intelligence reports on American radar cruisers and understood that low-altitude approaches offered the best chance of penetrating their defensive systems. His aircraft carried a 500-pound bomb that could cause devastating damage if delivered accurately. The Oakland's lookout spotted Seiki's fighter at 3,000 yards, just as the aircraft pulled up from its sea-skimming approach and began its final attack dive. The ship's portside 20mm guns opened fire immediately, filling the air with tracers as they tracked the diving fighter. Seiki's Zero was hit multiple times during its final approach, but the pilot maintained control with expert skill as his aircraft absorbed punishment that would have downed a less experienced aviator. At 1,000 yards, the fighter was trailing smoke from its engine, but Seiki held his course toward the Oakland's superstructure where her radar antennas and fire control equipment were concentrated. The Oakland's portside 40mm guns joined the engagement at 800 yards, their heavier shells punching holes through the Zero's wings and fuselage. But Seiki continued his attack with grim determination, his aircraft now on fire but still under control as it dove toward its target. At 300 yards, concentrated fire from 6 20mm guns finally found the Zero's engine, causing a massive explosion that sent the fighter cartwheeling out of control. The aircraft crashed into the sea just 100 yards from the Oakland's hull, close enough for the crew to see the pilot's face as his burning aircraft hit the water. Seiki's attack had failed by the narrowest possible margin, but his sacrifice epitomized the desperate courage of the kamikaze pilots who were willing to die to defend their homeland. The 6th Kikusui attack would claim 2 American destroyers and damage a dozen other ships, but the radar coordination provided by the Oakland and her sisters would prevent the Japanese from achieving the decisive victory they sought. While the Pacific War raged between American and Japanese forces, German naval intelligence was closely monitoring the development of radar-controlled anti-aircraft systems that were revolutionizing naval warfare. Captain Zur C. Wilhelm Dahms, head of the Kriegsmarine's Technical Intelligence Division, had obtained detailed reports on the Atlanta-class cruisers through a combination of captured documents and agent networks operating in neutral countries. Dahms understood that the American development of integrated radar and fire control systems represented a fundamental breakthrough in naval technology that German designers had failed to achieve. The Atlanta-class cruisers were capable of engaging multiple aerial targets simultaneously with an accuracy that no German ship could match, giving the Americans a decisive advantage in anti-aircraft warfare. The American radar cruisers represent a quantum leap in naval fire control, Dahms explained to Grand Admiral Karl Donitz during a briefing at German naval headquarters in Berlin in March 1945. They have successfully integrated search radar, fire control radar, and automatic gun direction into a single system that can engage targets with unprecedented accuracy. German attempts to develop similar capabilities had been hampered by material shortages, competing priorities, and the fundamental weakness of German electronics industry compared to American manufacturers like Western Electric and General Electric. The few German ships that had been equipped with radar-operated primitive systems that provided basic detection capability but lacked the precision necessary for accurate fire control. Dahms had also obtained intelligence on the American VT proximity fused shell, the revolutionary ammunition that had transformed anti-aircraft warfare by exploding automatically when it came within lethal range of an enemy aircraft. German scientists had been working on similar technology since 1942, but had been unable to develop a practical system due to limitations in miniaturized electronics and manufacturing precision. The Americans have achieved something we have been unable to duplicate, Dahms admitted to his staff officers during a technical briefing in April 1945. Their proximity-fused shells are 3 to 5 times more effective than conventional time-fused ammunition, giving their anti-aircraft guns a lethality that we cannot match with our current technology. The German assessment of American radar technology was entirely accurate, but it came too late to influence the outcome of the war. By April 1945, German naval power had been effectively eliminated, with most major units either sunk or trapped in port by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority. The lessons learned from studying American radar cruisers would never be applied to German warship design. But German naval intelligence had correctly identified the revolutionary nature of the Atlanta-class design, recognizing that these ships represented the future of naval warfare in an age when aircraft posed the primary threat to surface vessels. The integration of radar, fire control, and rapid-fire guns that characterized the Atlanta-class would become the standard for all major navies in the post-war period. The Regia Marina's assessment of American anti-aircraft capabilities was colored by the Italian Navy's own struggles with air defense throughout the Mediterranean campaign. Admiral Angelo Iacchino, who had commanded Italian forces during several major engagements with the Royal Navy, understood better than most the critical importance of effective anti-aircraft systems for modern naval operations. Italian warships had been consistently outclassed by British vessels equipped with radar and advanced fire control systems, suffering devastating losses in night actions where British radar provided a decisive advantage. The Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941 had demonstrated the vulnerability of Italian ships operating without radar, as British forces had used their electronic superiority to surprise and destroy an entire cruiser division. The Americans have solved the fundamental problem of fleet air defense, Iacchino explained to his staff officers during a briefing at the Italian naval base at Taranto in February 1943. Their radar cruisers can detect and engage aerial targets at ranges that make coordinated attack virtually impossible. This represents a revolution in naval tactics that we have been unable to match. Italian attempts to develop effective radar systems had been hampered by the same factors that had limited German progress: inadequate electronics industry, material shortages, and competing priorities for scarce resources. The few Italian ships that had been equipped with experimental radar systems had found them unreliable and difficult to maintain under combat conditions. The Italian Navy had also struggled with the integration of different weapon systems, lacking the industrial base necessary to develop coordinated fire control systems that could direct multiple guns against aerial targets simultaneously. Italian anti-aircraft guns were individually effective, but they could not be coordinated with the precision that characterized American systems like those mounted on the Atlanta-class cruisers. Capitano di Vascello Mario de Courten, who would later become Chief of Staff of the Italian Navy during the post-war Reconstruction period, had studied intelligence reports on American radar technology and understood its implications for future naval development. De Courten recognized that Italy would need to completely rebuild its approach to naval fire control if it hoped to operate effectively in the post-war world. The Americans have demonstrated that the future of naval warfare belongs to ships equipped with integrated radar and fire control systems. De Courten wrote in a confidential report to the Italian naval staff in March 1943. Our post-war construction programs must prioritize the development of similar capabilities if we hope to maintain a viable naval force. The Italian assessment proved prophetic. During the Cold War period, the Marina Militare would adopt American-style integrated air defense systems for its major combatants, developing the Garibaldi-class helicopter cruisers and later the Cavour-class aircraft carriers with fire control systems based on American radar technology. The lessons learned from studying the Atlanta-class cruisers would influence Italian naval design for decades to come. May 25, 1945. The 10th and final Kikusui attack of the Okinawa campaign began at dawn, as 150 Japanese aircraft launched from airfields throughout Kyushu for what would be the last large-scale kamikaze attack of World War II. By this point in the campaign, Japanese air strength had been so severely depleted that organizing even a modest attack required scraping together aircraft from training units and using pilots with minimal combat experience. The USS Oakland had been operating continuously in the combat zone for 2 months, her crew exhausted by the constant strain of kamikaze attacks and her systems showing the wear of extended combat operations. The ship had been struck twice by kamikaze aircraft during the 8th Kikusui attack on May 4th, suffering moderate damage to her superstructure and radar systems, but her crew had managed to maintain her in fighting condition through heroic damage control efforts. Captain William Thomas looked out from the Oakland's bridge at a sea littered with the wreckage of 2 months of the most intense naval combat in history. 36 American ships had been sunk and 368 damaged during the Okinawa campaign, testament to the effectiveness of Japanese suicide tactics. But the kamikazes had failed in their ultimate objective. The American invasion fleet remained intact and capable of supporting the ground forces that were slowly crushing Japanese resistance on the island. The final Kikusui attack would be different from its predecessors, characterized more by desperation than by the careful planning that had marked earlier operations. Many of the aircraft were trainers or obsolete types pressed into service as kamikazes, flown by pilots who had received only the most basic instruction in suicide attack techniques. But desperation made them no less dangerous to American ships and sailors. Lieutenant Commander Robert Chun, now the Oakland's commanding officer after Captain Thomas had been transferred to staff duty, watched his radar screen as the final attack formation approached from the northwest. Chun had participated in every major engagement of the Okinawa campaign, earning a reputation as one of the finest air defense officers in the Pacific Fleet. Now he was about to face his greatest test as a commanding officer. All stations, air raid, came the announcement over the ship's general announcing system as the Oakland's crew rushed to battle stations for what they hoped would be the final time during the Okinawa campaign. The ship's guns trained skyward as her radar systems began tracking the approaching Japanese formation. The attack began at 07:15 hours when the first wave of kamikazes penetrated the combat air patrol and dove toward the radar picket stations surrounding Okinawa. But this attack lacked the coordination and intensity that had characterized earlier Kikusui operations, reflecting the severe degradation of Japanese air capability over the previous 2 months of intensive combat. The Oakland's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, engaging individual aircraft as they approached the task group formation. But the Japanese pilots were inexperienced and poorly coordinated, making tactical errors that allowed the American air defenses to engage them more effectively than had been possible during earlier attacks. Gunners Mate First Class Patricia Williams, now the Oakland's senior anti-aircraft gunnery petty officer, directed the ships close in defense as several Japanese aircraft penetrated the 5-inch barrage. Williams had become the unofficial symbol of women's contribution to naval combat operations, her courage and competence under fire earning recognition throughout the Pacific Fleet. A lone Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka rocket-powered suicide bomb approached the Oakland from the port quarter, its pilot aiming for the ship's superstructure where her radar antennas and fire control equipment were concentrated. The Oka was one of the most dangerous weapons in the Japanese arsenal, capable of achieving speeds that made interception extremely difficult. But the Oakland's crew was ready. The ship's 40mm and 20mm guns opened fire in perfect coordination, creating a wall of steel that no aircraft could penetrate. The Oka was hit dozens of times during its final approach, exploding just 200 yards from the ship's hull in a tremendous blast that shattered windows throughout the task group. When the final Kikusui attack ended at 09:30 hours, the Oakland had engaged 12 separate aircraft and scored confirmed kills on 7 of them. The ship had not suffered a single casualty, demonstrating the effectiveness of radar-directed anti-aircraft defense against even the most desperate suicide attacks. More importantly, the 10th Kikusui would be the last. Japanese air strength had been so severely depleted that no further large-scale attacks were possible, marking the end of organized kamikaze operations against American naval forces. The Atlanta-class cruisers had proven their worth in the ultimate test of anti-aircraft warfare, protecting American task forces through 2 months of the most intense aerial combat in naval history. September 2, 1945. The formal surrender of Japan aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay marked the end of World War II, and the beginning of a comprehensive analysis of the weapons and tactics that had determined the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. Among the most important subjects of study were the Atlanta-class cruisers, whose revolutionary design had proven decisive in defeating the Japanese kamikaze offensive. Rear Admiral William Blandy, head of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, was tasked with preparing a comprehensive report on American anti-aircraft effectiveness during the Pacific War. Blandy's team had access to detailed combat reports from every major engagement, allowing them to analyze the performance of different weapon systems with unprecedented precision. The Atlanta-class cruisers represent the most successful anti-aircraft platform developed during the war, Blandy wrote in his preliminary assessment dated September 15, 1945. These ships consistently demonstrated the ability to engage multiple targets simultaneously with a level of effectiveness that no other vessel could match. The statistics supported Blandy's conclusions. Atlanta-class cruisers had collectively engaged more than 2,000 Japanese aircraft during the war, scoring confirmed kills on 437 enemy planes while suffering relatively light casualties among their own crews. More importantly, the ships had successfully protected the aircraft carriers and transport vessels that were their primary responsibility, contributing directly to American victory in every major campaign. The integration of radar and fire control systems that characterized the Atlanta-class had proven to be the key to their success. Traditional anti-aircraft defense had relied on volume of fire and luck, but the Atlanta-class ships could engage targets with precision that made their defensive firepower far more effective than their raw gun counts might suggest. Commander Eugene Wilkinson, one of the Navy's leading experts on fire control systems, prepared a detailed technical analysis of the radar systems that had made the Atlanta-class so effective. Wilkinson's report would influence American warship design for decades, establishing the principle that effective anti-aircraft defense required the integration of detection, tracking, and engagement systems into a single coordinated whole. The Mark 37 gun director, when combined with VT proximity fused ammunition, achieved hit probabilities that were 3 to 5 times higher than conventional fire control systems, Wilkinson wrote in his technical assessment. This represents a quantum leap in anti-aircraft effectiveness that has fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. The success of the Atlanta-class had not gone unnoticed by potential adversaries. Soviet naval intelligence had obtained detailed information on American radar technology through espionage networks operating in the United States, and Soviet designers were already working on similar systems for their own warships. The Cold War arms race in naval technology had begun even before World War II had officially ended. But the lessons of the Atlanta-class extended beyond pure technical considerations. These ships had demonstrated the critical importance of crew training and tactical innovation in maximizing the effectiveness of advanced weapons systems. The most sophisticated radar in the world was useless without skilled operators who understood how to employ it effectively under combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander Robert Chen, now commanding officer of the USS Tucson, the last Atlanta-class cruiser to be completed, participated in post-war exercises designed to evaluate American anti-aircraft capabilities against potential future threats. Chen understood that the kamikaze attacks at Okinawa represented only the beginning of the guided missile age, and that future enemies would possess weapons far more sophisticated than human-piloted aircraft. The principles we learned fighting the kamikazes will apply to any air threat, Chen explained to his officers during a training exercise off the California coast in October 1945. Early detection, accurate tracking, and concentrated firepower, directed by radar, these will be the keys to survival in any future war. Chen's assessment would prove prophetic. The Atlanta-class design would directly influence the development of post-war cruisers like the Worcester-class and Des Moines-class, ships that carried the integration of radar and fire control to even higher levels of sophistication. More importantly, the tactical principles developed during the kamikaze campaigns would form the foundation for the air defense systems that would protect American naval forces throughout the Cold War and beyond. The end of World War II brought massive changes to the American shipbuilding industry, as government contracts were canceled and companies struggled to adapt to peacetime markets. Federal shipbuilding, which had employed more than 25,000 workers at the peak of wartime production, saw its workforce shrink to fewer than 5,000 by the end of 1946. Lynn Korndorff, Federal's president throughout the war years, understood that the company's future depended on its ability to transition from wartime naval construction to peacetime commercial shipbuilding. But the conversion proved more difficult than anticipated, as American merchant shipping faced intense competition from foreign yards with lower labor costs and government subsidies. Federal's last major naval contract was the completion of the USS Worcester and USS Roanoke, ships that represented the culmination of everything the company had learned about advanced warship construction during the war years. But even as these sophisticated cruisers were being completed, it was clear that the age of gun-armed warships was ending, replaced by guided missile systems that would require different manufacturing capabilities. Rosa Martinez, who had supervised electrical installation for the Atlanta-class and Worcester-class ships, found herself training workers for commercial vessel construction as Federal sought to establish a foothold in the peacetime merchant marine market. But the skills that had made Federal successful in naval construction precision manufacturing, complex systems integration, and high-quality craftsmanship proved less important in commercial shipbuilding where cost control was the primary consideration. "We built the finest warships in the world," Martinez reflected during her retirement ceremony in 1950. "But the world has changed, and what made us great during the war doesn't necessarily guarantee success in peacetime." Federal shipbuilding would struggle through the late 1940s, completing a few commercial vessels and maintaining its facilities in hopes of future naval contracts. But the company's financial situation continued to deteriorate, and on April 23, 1948, President Korndorf announced that the United States Navy had agreed to purchase Federal's facilities for approximately $2 million. The Kearny shipyard would continue to operate under Navy ownership for several more years, primarily as a ship repair and modification facility. But the era of Federal shipbuilding as a major force in American naval construction had ended, a victim of the same demobilization that affected much of American industry after World War II. The site that had once employed tens of thousands of workers building the most advanced warships in the world would eventually be converted to commercial use, becoming the River Terminal Distribution Facility that serves the Port of New York and New Jersey today. But the legacy of Federal shipbuilding lives on in the design principles and construction techniques that influenced American naval architecture for decades after the last ship left the ways at Kearny Point. The workers who had built the Atlanta-class cruisers carried their expertise throughout American industry during the post-war economic boom. The precision manufacturing techniques required for radar systems found applications in the emerging electronics industry, while the systems integration approaches developed for complex warships influenced everything from commercial aircraft to nuclear power plants. William Chun, the master machinist who had ensured the precise tolerances of the Atlanta's turbine installations, went on to work in the aerospace industry during the 1950s, applying his skills to the jet engines that would power the next generation of military and commercial aircraft. His son Robert, the Atlanta-class veteran, would later serve as technical advisor to the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile program, where the same principles of systems integration that had made the Atlanta-class effective would be applied to strategic nuclear weapons. Thomas Brennan, Federal's chief naval architect, established his own consulting firm after the war, working on projects ranging from commercial shipping to early space program components. The engineering management techniques he had developed during Atlanta-class construction would influence major industrial projects throughout the American economy during the post-war boom years. The influence of Federal shipbuilding's wartime achievements extended far beyond the immediate participants to shape American industrial capability for generations. The precision manufacturing standards established for naval radar systems became the foundation for the electronics industry that would eventually produce computers, telecommunication systems, and the digital revolution that transformed American society. The principles of integrated air defense pioneered by the Atlanta-class cruisers would prove even more relevant during the Cold War, as the Soviet Union developed increasingly sophisticated aircraft and missiles that threatened American naval forces worldwide. The radar-guided fire control systems that had proven so effective against kamikaze attacks became the foundation for the surface-to-air missile systems that would define naval warfare for the next 50 years. Admiral William Rayburn, head of the Navy's Special Projects Office during the 1950s, understood that guided missiles represented the future of both offensive and defensive naval warfare. But Rayburn also recognized that the fire control principles developed for the Atlanta-class cruisers would be essential for making missile systems effective against high-speed aerial targets. The radar integration we achieved with the 5-inch 38 gun will be even more critical with guided missiles, Rayburn explained to his staff officers during the development of the Terrier surface-to-air missile system. We need to be able to detect, track, and engage multiple targets simultaneously, just as the Atlanta-class ships did against the Kamikazes. The Terrier missile system, first deployed on the cruiser USS Boston, CAG-1, in 1955, incorporated many of the same design principles that had made the Atlanta-class so effective. The system could track multiple targets simultaneously using advanced radar technology, and it could engage aircraft at ranges far beyond anything possible with conventional guns. But the transition from guns to missiles also created new challenges that the Atlanta-class designers had never faced. Guided missiles were far more expensive than conventional ammunition, limiting the number of engagements that a single ship could conduct. More importantly, missile systems were much more complex and difficult to maintain than gun systems, requiring specialized technical personnel and elaborate support facilities. Captain Robert Chen, now commanding officer of the guided missile cruiser USS Long Beach, CGN-9, the world's first nuclear-powered surface combatant, applied the lessons he had learned aboard Atlanta-class ships to the challenges of missile warfare during the 1960s. Chen understood that crew training and tactical innovation would be just as important with missile systems as they had been with radar-directed guns. The technology has changed, but the principles remain the same, Chen explained to his officers during Long Beach's shakedown cruise in 1961. Early detection, accurate tracking, and rapid engagement, these are still the keys to successful air defense, whether we're using 5-inch guns or guided missiles. Chen's assessment would be validated during the Long Beach's deployment to Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, where the ship's advanced air defense systems proved highly effective against North Vietnamese aircraft. The radar integration principles first developed for the Atlanta-class cruisers had successfully transitioned to the missile age, providing American naval forces with air defense capabilities that no other navy could match. The development of the Aegis combat system during the 1970s represented the ultimate evolution of the Atlanta-class concept. Aegis could simultaneously track hundreds of aerial targets and engage dozens of them with guided missiles, providing fleet air defense capabilities that the designers of the original Atlanta could never have imagined. But the fundamental principles remained unchanged: early detection through advanced radar, precise tracking of multiple targets, and coordinated engagement to maximize defensive effectiveness. The first Aegis-equipped ship, the cruiser USS Ticonderoga, CG-47, was commissioned in 1983, nearly 40 years after the last Atlanta-class cruiser had entered service. But the Ticonderoga's combat system incorporated lessons learned from every generation of American air defense development, including the pioneering work done aboard the Atlanta-class cruisers during World War II. The success of the Atlanta-class design had not gone unnoticed by Allied and potential enemy navies around the world, all of whom studied American radar technology and sought to develop similar capabilities for their own warships. The Royal Navy, Soviet Navy, and French Navy all developed post-war cruiser designs that incorporated lessons learned from the Atlanta-class experience. The Royal Navy's Tiger-class cruisers, completed in the late 1950s, mounted a similar arrangement of dual-purpose guns controlled by advanced radar systems. But the British ships were much larger and more expensive than the Atlanta-class, reflecting the Royal Navy's emphasis on global operations and extended endurance rather than concentrated firepower. Admiral Sir Roderick MacGregor, First Sea Lord during the development of the Tiger-class, had studied detailed intelligence reports on Atlanta-class performance during World War II and understood the revolutionary nature of the American design. But MacGregor also recognized that British naval requirements were different from American needs, requiring ships capable of independent operations in distant waters. The Americans achieved remarkable effectiveness with their radar cruisers, MacGregor explained to the British naval staff during Tiger-class design reviews in 1951. But their ships were designed to operate as part of large task forces with extensive logistical support. Our requirements call for ships capable of independent operations worldwide. The Tiger-class would prove less successful than the Atlanta-class, primarily because the British ships were completed after guided missiles had made gun-based air defense systems obsolete. Only 3 Tigers were completed, and they were converted to helicopter carriers within a few years of commissioning, reflecting the rapid pace of technological change in naval warfare during the 1950s and 60s. The Soviet Navy took a different approach, developing the Sverdlov-class cruisers as multi-purpose platforms capable of both surface warfare and anti-aircraft defense. But Soviet radar technology lagged significantly behind American capabilities, limiting the effectiveness of Soviet air defense systems throughout the Cold War period. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who would build the Soviet Navy into a global force during the 1960s and 70s, understood the importance of the radar integration principles pioneered by the Atlanta-class. But Soviet technological limitations prevented the development of systems comparable to American capabilities until much later in the Cold War. The Americans achieved a significant advantage in naval air defense through their integration of radar and fire control systems, Gorshkov wrote in his memoirs, published after the end of the Cold War. We were never able to completely close this gap, despite our best efforts throughout the 1950s and 60s. The French Navy's approach was more successful, developing the Colbert-class cruisers with advanced radar systems based partly on American technology provided through NATO cooperation. The Colbert incorporated many of the design principles that had made the Atlanta-class effective, demonstrating that the American achievement could be successfully adapted to different naval requirements. Modern naval forces around the world continue to apply principles first established by the Atlanta-class cruisers. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy has developed the Type 055 destroyer with air defense systems clearly influenced by American Aegis technology, while the Russian Navy's Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates incorporate multi-layer defense systems designed to engage aerial threats at multiple ranges simultaneously. Today, more than 80 years after the first Atlanta-class cruiser was launched, the design principles pioneered by these revolutionary ships continue to influence naval warfare around the world. Every modern warship incorporates some version of the integrated radar and fire control systems that first proved their worth in combat against kamikaze attacks at Okinawa. The Aegis combat system, currently deployed on American cruisers and destroyers as well as Allied warships worldwide, represents the ultimate evolution of the radar integration concepts first developed for the Atlanta class. Aegis can simultaneously track hundreds of aerial targets and engage dozens of them with guided missiles, providing air defense capabilities that the designers of the original Atlanta could never have imagined. Admiral Gary Roughead, Chief of Naval Operations from 2007 to 2011, understood the historical continuity between the Atlanta-class cruisers and modern American naval air defense systems. Roughead had served aboard both gun-armed and missile-equipped ships during his career, giving him unique insight into the evolution of naval technology. "The principles haven't changed," Roughead explained during a speech at the Naval War College in 2010. "We still need early detection, accurate tracking, and the ability to engage multiple targets simultaneously." The Atlanta-class cruisers proved these principles in combat, and we've been refining them ever since. Modern naval threats are far more sophisticated than the kamikaze aircraft that the Atlanta-class was designed to defeat, but the fundamental challenge remains the same: protecting high-value ships and installations from air attack. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and unmanned aerial vehicles pose threats that would have been science fiction in 1945, but they require the same defensive approach that made the Atlanta class effective. The newest American destroyers, the Arleigh Burke Flight III class, carry radar systems that can detect and track targets at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles, far beyond the capabilities of World War II technology. But these ships also carry close-in defense systems like the Phalanx CIWS, close-in weapon system, that serve the same function as the 20mm guns mounted on the Atlanta-class cruisers. Captain Robert Chin Jr., son of the Atlanta-class veteran and commanding officer of the guided missile destroyer USS John Paul Jones, DDG-53, represents the continuation of naval tradition from the gun age to the missile age and beyond. Chun understands that his ship's sophisticated Aegis system is the direct descendant of the fire control technology that his father helped pioneer during World War II. "Every engagement we fight validates the lessons our predecessors learned," Chin explained during a recent interview about modern naval air defense. "The technology has advanced tremendously, but the basic principles of coordinated defense remain unchanged from what the Atlanta-class ships proved in combat." The influence of Atlanta-class principles extends beyond traditional naval warfare to include homeland security and commercial vessel protection. Modern port security systems use integrated radar and response capabilities modeled on naval air defense concepts, while critical infrastructure protection relies on the same layered defense approach that made the Atlanta-class effective against aerial threats. Behind the statistics and technical achievements of the Atlanta-class cruisers lies a more sobering reality: the human cost of the campaign that proved their effectiveness. The Battle of Okinawa was the bloodiest Pacific campaign of World War II, claiming the lives of more than 12,000 American sailors and Marines and an estimated 110,000 Japanese military personnel and civilians. The radar picket stations that the Atlanta-class cruisers helped coordinate were among the most dangerous assignments in the Pacific Fleet, claiming dozens of destroyers and thousands of American lives. The men who served aboard these isolated ships understood that they were trading their own safety for the protection of the main fleet, a sacrifice that exemplified the courage and dedication that characterized the United States Navy throughout the war. Commander Frederick Johnson, commanding officer of the destroyer USS Roberts that survived 6 kamikaze strikes and 4 bomb hits during 80 minutes of continuous combat at Radar Picket Station Number One, later wrote about the experience in his personal memoir, published in 1975. "We knew we were expendable," Johnson wrote. "Our job was to absorb the Japanese attacks and give the rest of the fleet time to prepare. The Atlanta-class cruisers were coordinating the defense, but it was the destroyer men who paid the price in blood." Johnson's assessment was accurate. The destroyers and destroyer escorts manning the radar picket stations suffered casualty rates that exceeded those of any other type of naval unit during World War II. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The radar picket system they helped implement became the foundation for all subsequent naval air defense doctrine. The Japanese perspective on the human cost was equally sobering. More than 4,000 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign, representing virtually the entire remaining pool of trained naval aviators. The failure of the kamikaze offensive to achieve its strategic objectives effectively ended Japan's ability to defend itself against invasion, contributing directly to the decision to surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, who had helped develop kamikaze tactics and witnessed their failure against American radar-directed air defenses, later wrote about the experience with remarkable candor, considering his role in the Japanese war effort. "We threw away the lives of our finest young men in attacks that were doomed to failure," Inaguchi wrote in his post-war memoir. "The American radar cruisers had made our traditional tactics obsolete, but our military leadership was unwilling to acknowledge this reality until it was too late. The human cost of proving the effectiveness of the Atlanta-class design extends beyond the immediate casualties of the Okinawa campaign. Thousands of American workers in shipyards like Federal Shipbuilding had worked themselves to exhaustion building the ships that would protect American forces in the Pacific. Many of them suffered long-term health effects from the industrial chemicals and processes used in wartime construction, a price that was not fully understood until decades later." Rosa Martinez, who had supervised electrical installation for both the Atlanta-class and Worcester-class cruisers, developed respiratory problems in her later years that were eventually linked to asbestos exposure during wartime shipbuilding. Martinez's case was typical of thousands of shipyard workers who sacrificed their health to build the ships that won the war. "We knew we were doing important work," Martinez said during an interview in 1995, shortly before her death from mesothelioma. "We didn't know the price we would pay for it later, but I don't think it would have changed anything. The war had to be won, and we did what we had to do." The development and production of the Atlanta-class cruisers represented more than just the creation of effective warships. They marked a fundamental transformation in American industrial capability that would influence the nation's economic development for decades to come. The integration of advanced electronics, precision manufacturing, and complex systems engineering required for these ships pushed American technology to new levels of sophistication. The radar systems mounted on the Atlanta-class ships required manufacturing tolerances and quality control standards that had never been achieved in mass production before World War II. Companies like Western Electric, General Electric, and Westinghouse had to develop entirely new production techniques to build the thousands of radar sets needed for American warships. Dr. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II, understood that the technological advances required for weapons like the Atlanta-class fire control systems would have applications far beyond military requirements. The precision electronics industry that developed to support radar production would eventually lead to the development of computers, telecommunication systems, and the digital revolution that would transform American society in the post-war period. "The radar technology we developed for naval fire control represents a fundamental breakthrough in electronics engineering," Bush explained in a confidential report to President Roosevelt in December 1944. "The manufacturing techniques and quality control procedures we've established will have applications throughout American industry after the war." Bush's prediction proved accurate. Many of the companies that had manufactured radar systems for the Atlanta-class cruisers would go on to become leaders in the post-war electronics industry. Western Electric's experience with precision manufacturing would contribute to the development of the transistor at Bell Laboratories, while General Electric's radar work would lead to advances in early computer technology. The systems integration approach pioneered for the Atlanta-class also influenced post-war industrial development. The need to coordinate radar, fire control, and weapon systems into a single effective platform required new approaches to engineering management and quality control that would later be applied to civilian products ranging from automobiles to commercial aircraft. Federal Shipbuilding's experience with complex project management during Atlanta-class construction contributed to the development of modern industrial engineering techniques. The company had to coordinate the work of hundreds of subcontractors and suppliers to deliver ships that met unprecedented standards of technical sophistication, requiring management approaches that were revolutionary for their time. Thomas Brennan, Federal's chief naval architect throughout the war years, later worked as a consultant to the American automobile industry during the 1950s, applying the systems engineering principles he had learned in shipbuilding to the development of more sophisticated passenger cars. Brennan's work contributed to the integration of complex electrical and mechanical systems that characterizes modern automotive design. Building the Atlanta class taught us how to manage complexity, Brennan explained during a lecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1960. The same principles we use to integrate radar and guns can be applied to any complex technological system. The influence of Atlanta-class technology extended beyond American industry to affect global technological development. The technical specifications and performance data for these ships were studied by engineers and designers throughout the world, contributing to advances in radar technology, fire control systems, and naval architecture that influenced international industrial capabilities for decades. More than 80 years after the launch of the first Atlanta-class cruiser, the fundamental principles these ships embodied continue to shape naval warfare and defense planning around the world. The integration of sensors, processing systems, and weapons that made the Atlanta-class revolutionary has become the standard approach to all modern military systems. The current generation of American naval leaders includes officers whose grandfathers served aboard Atlanta-class cruisers, creating a direct link between the pioneers of radar warfare and the commanders who must defend against 21st-century threats. Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations from 2015 to 2019, understood this historical continuity and its relevance to modern naval challenges. The Atlanta-class cruisers faced the same fundamental challenge we face today: how to protect high-value assets from aerial attack. Richardson explained during a speech at the Naval Academy in 2018. The technology has evolved tremendously, but the basic requirement for early detection, accurate tracking, and coordinated engagement remains unchanged. Modern threats to naval forces include hypersonic missiles, swarm attacks by unmanned aerial vehicles, and cyber warfare directed against the electronic systems that control ship defenses. These threats would have been incomprehensible to the designers of the Atlanta class, but they require defensive approaches based on the same principles that made those ships effective against kamikaze attacks. The newest American warships, including the Arleigh Burke Flight III destroyers and the planned DDG-X next-generation destroyers, incorporate defensive systems that can be traced directly back to innovations first implemented on the Atlanta-class cruisers. The ability to detect and engage multiple threats simultaneously, which was revolutionary in 1945, has become essential for survival against modern weapons systems. But the lessons of the Atlanta class extend beyond pure technology to include the human factors that determine success or failure in combat. The training, discipline, and courage displayed by the crews of these ships during the most intense air battles in naval history remain relevant to modern naval personnel facing different but equally challenging threats. Captain Sarah Chun, commanding officer of the guided missile destroyer USS Zumwalt, DDG-1000, and great-granddaughter of Atlanta-class veteran William Chun, represents the continuation of naval tradition into the 21st century. Chun understands that her ship's sophisticated systems are evolutionary descendants of the technology her great-grandfather helped build at Federal Shipbuilding. Technology changes, but the fundamentals of naval warfare remain constant. Chin explained during a recent interview about modern naval air defense. We still need ships that can detect threats early, process information quickly, and respond with overwhelming force. The Atlanta class proved these principles in combat, and we're still applying them today. The global influence of Atlanta-class design principles can be seen in the naval forces of allied nations that have adopted similar approaches to integrated air defense. The Royal Navy's Type 45 destroyers, the French Navy's Horizon-class frigates, and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces Atago-class destroyers all incorporate sensor integration and fire control concepts that were pioneered by the Atlanta-class more than 8 decades ago. The USS Oakland made her final voyage in 1947, steaming from the Pacific Fleet anchorage at San Francisco Bay to the Navy's mothball fleet at Sassoon Bay, where she would wait with hundreds of other World War II veterans for a future that would never come. The ship that had coordinated air defense for the largest naval operation in history was now surplus to requirements, a victim of the same rapid technological change that had made her revolutionary just 6 years earlier. Captain Robert Chun, the Oakland's final commanding officer, stood on his ship's bridge as tugboats guided her toward her berth among the ghostly rows of decommissioned warships. Chun had served aboard Atlanta-class cruisers throughout the Pacific War, from the desperate battles around Guadalcanal to the final victory off the coast of Japan. Now he was saying goodbye to the ships that had defined his naval career and helped win the greatest war in human history. "She was the finest ship I ever served aboard," Chun wrote in his final log entry as the Oakland's commanding officer. She and her sisters proved that American innovation and industrial might could overcome any challenge. The principles we pioneered will serve the Navy long after these ships are forgotten. Chen's prediction proved accurate, though the ships themselves would not be forgotten as completely as he had expected. Today, the Atlanta-class cruisers are remembered as among the most influential warship designs in naval history, vessels that successfully bridged the gap between the gun age and the missile age and established principles that continue to guide naval development today. The 8 Atlanta-class cruisers collectively earned 54 battle stars during their brief but eventful careers, participating in every major campaign of the Pacific War from Midway to the surrender of Japan. 2 ships, Atlanta and Juno, were lost in combat, but their sacrifice contributed to victories that changed the course of world history. The 6 survivors served through the final months of the war, protecting American forces during the most dangerous missions in naval combat. But the true legacy of the Atlanta-class extends far beyond their combat record or battle honors. These ships proved that the integration of advanced technology, innovative tactics, and skilled personnel could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The radar-directed fire control systems that made them effective against kamikaze attacks became the foundation for all subsequent naval air defense development. Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company closed its doors forever on April 23, 1948, but the company's legacy lived on in the ships it had built and the technological advances it had pioneered. The 17-acre facility at Kearney Point would eventually be converted to commercial use, but the innovations developed there during the construction of the Atlanta-class cruisers would influence American industry for decades to come. The workers who had built these revolutionary ships carried their expertise throughout American industry during the post-war economic boom. Rosa Martinez's precision wiring techniques were adopted by the emerging electronics industry, while Heinrich Müller's welding innovations contributed to advances in aircraft and automobile construction. The system's engineering approaches developed by Thomas Brennan influenced everything from skyscraper construction to space program management. Today, the site of Federal Shipbuilding is part of the River Terminal Development Complex, a massive distribution facility that serves the port of New York and New Jersey. Few visitors to the busy cargo terminal realize they are walking on ground where some of the most advanced warships in history were constructed by workers whose skill and dedication helped determine the outcome of World War II. But the memory of the Atlanta-class cruisers and the people who built them lives on in the United States Navy, where their influence can be seen in every modern warship that carries integrated radar and fire control systems. The Aegis combat system that protects American task forces today is the direct descendant of the Mark 37 gun directors that made the Atlanta-class so effective against kamikaze attacks. September 11, 2024. The guided missile destroyer USS John Finn, DDG-113, steams through the South China Sea as part of a freedom of navigation patrol, her advanced radar systems scanning for potential threats in an increasingly contested maritime environment. The ship's Aegis combat system can simultaneously track more than 1,000 aerial targets and engage dozens of them with standard missiles, providing air defense capabilities that the designers of the Atlanta-class cruisers could never have imagined. Commander Jennifer Chun, the John Finn's commanding officer and great-great-granddaughter of Federal Shipbuilding worker William Chun, understands that her ship represents the culmination of technological development that began with the first Atlanta-class cruiser more than 80 years earlier. The principles of early detection, accurate tracking, and coordinated engagement that made those ships revolutionary have been refined and enhanced through 8 decades of technological progress. Every system on this ship can trace its ancestry back to innovations first implemented during World War II. Chin explained to her junior officers during a training exercise in the Philippine Sea. The Atlanta-class cruisers proved that radar-directed fire control could defeat massed air attacks. We've been building on that foundation ever since. The threats facing modern naval forces are far more sophisticated than the kamikaze aircraft that tested the Atlanta-class cruisers at Okinawa, but they require the same defensive philosophy. Multiple layers of detection and engagement systems working together to protect high-value targets from air attack. Ballistic missiles launched from thousands of miles away, cruise missiles skimming just above the wave tops, and swarms of unmanned aerial vehicles all pose challenges that demand the same systematic approach to defense that made the Atlanta-class effective. The John Finn's Combat Information Center bears little resemblance to the cramped spaces where Atlanta-class radar operators tracked Japanese aircraft on primitive oscilloscope screens, but the mission remains essentially unchanged. Modern radar systems can detect threats at ranges exceeding 400 nautical miles, but the fundamental requirement for early warning and coordinated response has not changed since Commander Robert Chun first tracked kamikaze formations approaching Okinawa in 1945. The human element remains as important today as it was during World War II. The most sophisticated radar system in the world is useless without trained operators who understand how to interpret contacts and coordinate defensive measures. The tradition of excellence established by the crews of the Atlanta-class cruisers continues in the modern Navy, where sailors train constantly to master systems far more complex than their predecessors could have imagined. As the John Finn maintains her patrol in contested waters, her crew carries forward the legacy of innovation and courage that began in the shipyards of New Jersey more than 80 years ago. The 16 radar cruisers that stood against 10,000 kamikazes have become the foundation for a global network of air defense systems that protects free nations around the world. The sky that turned red over Okinawa in 1945 has given way to new challenges and new threats, but the principles proven in that crucible of combat remain as relevant today as they were when federal shipbuilding's workers first installed radar systems aboard ships designed to defend democracy against tyranny. The Atlanta-class cruisers proved that American innovation, industrial capability, and military courage could overcome any threat, a lesson that echoes across the decades as new generations of sailors stand watch in dangerous waters, ready to defend freedom against all enemies. The story of the Atlanta-class cruisers represents more than naval history. It captures the moment when American industrial might, technological innovation, and military determination combined to create weapons systems that would define the modern age. From the drawing boards of federal shipbuilding to the radar picket stations around Okinawa, these ships demonstrated that the integration of advanced technology with skilled personnel could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The 8 Atlanta-class cruisers built between 1940 and 1945 cost American taxpayers approximately $280 million, roughly $4.2 billion in today's currency. That investment purchased not just 8 warships, but the foundation for American technological superiority that would extend far beyond naval warfare to influence every aspect of modern life. The radar technology developed for the Atlanta-class became the basis for air traffic control systems that safely guide millions of passengers through the world's skies every year. The precision manufacturing techniques required for their fire control systems contributed to the quality standards that made American automobiles, aircraft, and consumer electronics the envy of the world during the post-war economic boom. The systems integration approaches pioneered during Atlanta-class construction influenced everything from the Apollo lunar program to modern internet infrastructure, demonstrating that military innovation often provides the foundation for civilian technological advancement. The same management techniques used to coordinate hundreds of contractors and suppliers during warship construction would later be applied to building skyscrapers, manufacturing commercial aircraft, and developing computer systems. But perhaps most importantly, the Atlanta-class cruisers proved that free democratic societies could out-innovate and out-produce totalitarian regimes when the survival of liberty was at stake. The ships were designed by engineers working in open collaboration with military personnel, built by workers who understood the importance of their mission, and operated by sailors who had volunteered to defend their country's values. The contrast with their enemies could not have been more stark. German and Japanese warships of the same period were often technically sophisticated but were built by slave labor and operated by personnel indoctrinated in ideologies that subordinated individual initiative to state control. The Atlanta class demonstrated that innovation flourishes in free societies where individuals can contribute their best efforts to common goals. Today, as new challenges emerge from authoritarian regimes that seek to challenge the international order established after World War II, the lessons of the Atlanta class remain as relevant as ever. The integration of advanced sensors, artificial intelligence, and precision weapons that characterizes modern military systems builds directly on principles first proven in combat by these remarkable ships and their crews. The guided missile destroyers that patrol the world's oceans today carry the genetic code of the Atlanta class in their combat systems, their operational doctrine, and their crew training programs. The same systematic approach to threat detection, target tracking, and engagement coordination that made the Atlanta class effective against kamikaze attacks now protects democratic nations against hypersonic missiles, cyber attacks, and other 21st century threats. From the machine shops of federal shipbuilding to the computer centers of modern warships, an unbroken chain of innovation connects the Atlanta-class cruisers to contemporary naval forces. Every technological advance has built upon previous achievements, creating a cumulative effect that has maintained American naval superiority for more than 8 decades. The vacuum tube radar systems that made the Atlanta-class revolutionary gave way to transistor-based electronics in the 1950s, which evolved into integrated circuits in the 1960s, microprocessors in the 1970s, and the artificial intelligence systems that control modern naval weapons today. But the fundamental mission remained constant: detect threats early, track them accurately, and engage them effectively. The mechanical computers that calculated firing solutions for Atlanta-class gun directors were the ancestors of the digital computers that now control every aspect of modern naval operations. The same logical processes that federal shipbuilding's engineers used to integrate radar and fire control systems in the 1940s became the software algorithms that manage contemporary combat systems. The training programs that prepared Atlanta-class crews for the complexities of radar warfare established educational principles that continue to guide naval personnel development today. The same emphasis on technical competence, tactical innovation, and operational excellence that characterized the crews of these World War II cruisers can be seen in the modern sailors who operate Aegis combat systems and other advanced military technologies. The maintenance procedures developed to keep Atlanta-class radar systems operational under combat conditions became the foundation for all subsequent military electronic support programs. The same attention to detail, systematic troubleshooting approaches, and preventive maintenance practices that kept World War II fire control systems functioning in battle continue to ensure the reliability of modern naval weapons systems. The logistics networks that supported Atlanta-class operations during the Pacific War established supply chain management principles that now support global military operations. The same coordination between manufacturers, repair facilities, and operational units that kept the Atlanta-class fighting throughout World War II enables modern naval forces to maintain combat readiness worldwide. The influence of Atlanta-class innovations extended far beyond American naval forces to transform military capabilities worldwide. Every major navy studied the design and performance of these ships, seeking to understand and adapt the principles that had made them so effective. The result was a global transformation in naval technology that raised the standard of air defense capabilities for all maritime nations. The Royal Navy's post-war cruiser designs incorporated radar integration concepts derived from Atlanta-class experience, while the French Navy developed its own versions of dual-purpose gun systems based on American innovations. Even potential adversaries like the Soviet Union worked to develop comparable capabilities, driving a technological competition that would continue throughout the Cold War. The NATO alliance that emerged after World War II was built partly on the foundation of shared technological capabilities that traced their origins to innovations like those pioneered by the Atlanta class. The ability of Allied naval forces to operate together effectively depended on common approaches to air defense that were based on American technological leadership established during the war. The export of American military technology to Allied nations spread Atlanta-class innovations throughout the free world, creating a network of compatible defense systems that could coordinate their efforts against common threats. The same radar frequencies, communications protocols, and tactical procedures that had proven effective against Japanese aircraft became the standard for NATO naval operations. The influence of Atlanta-class design principles can be seen today in the naval forces of nations that had no direct involvement in World War II but have adopted American approaches to integrated air defense. Countries like South Korea, Australia, and Spain operate warships equipped with systems that are direct descendants of innovations first proven in combat by the Atlanta-class cruisers. As this account concludes in late 2024, the mission that the Atlanta-class cruisers first performed in the waters around Okinawa continues aboard modern warships deployed around the world. American naval forces maintain the same vigilant watch that those World War II crews established, ready to defend democratic values against any threat that may emerge. The destroyers and cruisers that carry the Aegis combat system today are the evolutionary descendants of the Atlanta class, inheriting both their technological capabilities and their operational responsibilities. The same commitment to excellence, innovation, and service that characterized the builders and crews of the original ships continues in the modern Navy, where new generations of Americans carry forward the legacy of those who came before. The challenges facing contemporary naval forces are different from those encountered by the Atlanta class, but they require the same combination of advanced technology, skilled personnel, and tactical innovation that made those ships successful. Whether the threat comes from ballistic missiles, cyber attacks, or unmanned systems, the defensive principles remain constant: early detection, precise tracking, and coordinated engagement. The men and women who serve aboard today's warships understand that they are part of an unbroken tradition that extends back through every generation of American naval personnel who have defended the nation's interests on the high seas. They know that their sophisticated systems are the products of continuous innovation that began with the first radar installations aboard ships like the Atlanta-class cruisers. The industrial base that supports modern American naval forces traces its origins to companies like Federal Shipbuilding that proved American industry could produce the most advanced military systems in the world. The same engineering excellence, manufacturing precision, and quality control that characterized wartime production continue in the defense contractors who build today's naval weapons systems. The training institutions that prepare modern naval officers and enlisted personnel use educational methods that were first developed to teach World War II sailors how to operate revolutionary new technologies like radar and fire control systems. The same emphasis on technical competence, tactical thinking, and leadership development that characterized Atlanta-class crew preparation continues in today's naval education programs. As new technologies emerge and new threats develop, American naval forces will continue to apply the lessons learned from the Atlanta-class experience. That innovation, determination, and courage can overcome any challenge when they are combined with the industrial and technological capabilities of a free society dedicated to the defense of liberty and democracy. The 16 radar cruisers that faced 10,000 kamikazes established a standard of excellence that continues to inspire American naval personnel today. Their legacy lives on not just in the ships and systems that have succeeded them, but in the proof they provided that free people, armed with superior technology and guided by courage and determination, can prevail against any enemy of freedom. The sky over Okinawa turned red in 1945, but when the smoke cleared, American technology and American courage had proven victorious. That victory established principles that continue to guide American naval forces as they maintain their watch over the world's oceans, ready to defend democracy against all who would threaten it. The Atlanta-class cruisers showed the way forward, and their legacy endures in every modern warship that carries radar-guided weapons and the courage to use them in defense of freedom.